Okay, I guess we'll just go ahead and get started and people can come in that are coming late. So thank you everyone for taking the time out of your Friday to join us for this conversation. My name is Kayla and I'm this year's chair of the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought, and I co-lead this committee with my vice chairs Olivia Sealer and Avalon Fenster, with support from our amazing program coordinator, Andrew Wells. So for those of you that haven't joined us for an event in the past, the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought is the undergraduate branch of Columbia's Committee on Global Thought. And the Undergraduate Committee on Global Thought is essentially an open forum that connects undergraduate students to the rich resources on global issues available here at Columbia University. And we really aim to engage students from all the undergraduate schools here at Columbia on this interdisciplinary approach to thinking about global issues. So today's conversation, we're joined by Professor Carol Gluck in the second event of our Talks with Professors series on the politics of memory. Professor Gluck is the George Sampson Professor of History here at Columbia, and she specializes in modern Europe from the late 19th century to the present, as well as international relations, World War II, history writing, and public memory in Asia and the West. She's also a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. And she's actually one of the founding members of the Committee for Global Thought. So we have to give a big thanks to Professor Gluck for everything because we just wouldn't be here without her. She's also the past chair of the CGT, and she currently leads the transnational project on the politics of memory in the global context, which has held workshops around the world in Beijing and Paris. So today's conversation will center around the shaping of public memory and transnational memory activism, specifically in the context of the comfort women, so women across Asia and some women from Europe as well, who were systematically subjected to sexual enslavement during World War II. So the second part of this discussion will be a question and answer section. So if you have any questions throughout the conversation, please feel free to put them in the chat box below and we'll read them out to the professor. So with that introduction, I'll go ahead and pass it to Professor Gluck to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, and thank you, UCGT leaders and members. And I hope a lot of you, some of you in the audience who are undergraduates will join the UCGT and do what you will with it. The panorama is very broad and the prospects are unending. So I'm happy to talk about what I'm calling today Circles of Memory, the Comfort Women and the World. I know that many of you know that the comfort women, the sex slaves of the Japanese military in World War II, have been an increasingly present public issue. They were never a secret. People knew about the comfort women. They were in the Japanese press, in novels, even in parliamentary debate in Japan. But they only came into public memory during the 1990s. And now, 30 years later, the women who were used and abused in the so-called comfort stations across Asia, from the South Pacific to the Indian Ocean, are known around the world as victims of sexual violence and the violation of the human rights of women. Now that is in itself quite a story to tell, how this happened, how the comfort women came into memory. Now, no single source and no single organization and no single country was responsible for this comfort women becoming what is known as a traveling memory, a memory like that of the Holocaust, which moved around the globe and continues to move. And this happened because different agents of memory in different contexts with different perspectives and motivations took up the issue of the comfort women. They sometimes overlapped in their concern, these memory activists, and they sometimes contradicted one another. But these memory activists, agents of memories, worked both within and across national borders. And so they're often cited today as a model of effective transnational activism, which they were, but not without some less than positive aspects that I have increasingly found concerning. But before I tell you about that, let me first try to situate the memory activists in their different circles of memory. Now, there are many such circles, but I'll name 5. In the first circle are the victims themselves and their advocates, their supporters. Not now, Andrew. Later. Thank you. And in the first circle, the victims and their advocates were the first people to bring the comfort women to wider public attention. The agents of memory were the former comfort women themselves, who spoke out, the first and now famous Kim Hak-sun, in August of 1991, and told their stories in public for the first time. And memory activists then mobilized on their behalf. In South Korea in 1990, several women's groups formed the Korean Council for the Women Drafted for Military Slavery, which is still very active today under a different name. You should notice maybe that the name they used then evoked the colonial past, the 35 years of Japan's colonial rule over Korea, because they used the term drafted, women drafted, which is the term in Korean and Japanese for voluntary labor that was in fact involuntary. In Japan at the same time, progressive activists included lawyers, scholars, feminists, and journalists who were seeking to hold the Japanese government to account for their role in the comfort women system during the war. So in this first circle, both victims and their supporters were seeking both justice for the former comfort women and also recognition by the Japanese government of Japan's responsibility for its wartime actions. Now, the time or the context in South Korea was the democratization in the 1980s and the growth of women's organizations. In Japan, it was the surge of memory of World War II after the death of the wartime Emperor Hirohito in 1989, and the fall of the long-ruling Conservative Party in 1993. In both Japan and South Korea, there was an audience now ready to listen to the stories of the former comfort women, who were now of an age and of an anger ready to tell those stories. And this is very important. Without the context, without the readiness, the response would have been quite different. And the space or the place was national and regional in this first circle. It's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, essentially East and Southeast Asia. The second circle are activists on behalf of the human rights of women. And the agents of memory in this circle were international human rights activists, advocates, women, legal scholars, jurists, who were concerned not about Japan, Korea, or Asia, but about the human rights of women, in particular relation to present-day trafficking of women and to rape as a weapon of war. And so there were reports in the mid-1990s by the International Committee of Jurists and by two United Nations rapporteurs that focused on the comfort women system. And they called it sex slavery. They were the ones actually who publicly used that term. And the time or the context for this, now this happened during the same years as the former comfort women came forward in the first circle, was not the comfort women themselves, but the rise in the movement for international women's rights. The conferences in Vienna in 1993, the famous Beijing Women's Conference of 1995, the so-called rape camps in Bosnia during the war in Yugoslavia in 1992, followed by the international tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in 1993 and 94, Women's Caucus for Gender Justice, and the movement to establish an international criminal court. Now, these were international efforts, and the comfort women were routinely mentioned in the arguments for making rape a crime against humanity, rape during wartime. And this is what actually happened in the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court in 1998. And that was a major landmark in international law to make rape a crime against humanity in law. But the space for this was international and transnational human rights discourse. It was the United Nations and international law. Asia was not the focus, but it was an example. The main concern of these memory activists was to prevent what had happened to the comfort women from happening to women now and in the future. So here you have something happening at the same time. It's a conjuncture, but with very different concerns, and both are putting the comfort women forward as an instance of a grievous suffering in the past. The third circle, you might call diasporas in action. The agents of memory here, the memory activists, were initially in North America, Asian Americans and Asian Canadians, later in Australia, more recently in Germany and other places. And most of the activists in what is now called the Redress Movement are post-memory second and third generations, in the sense that they are not themselves immigrants. They are second and third, or sometimes even fourth generation diaspora. Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, and Japanese Americans too, for different reasons, engaged in the redress movement, supported congressional resolutions, supported the erection of statues and monuments to the comfort women, and worked to communicate the testimonies of surviving former comfort women to wider publics in their countries. And the time here in North America, the context was the politics of ethnic identity in the 1990s that combined with the growing electoral significance of Asian Americans and Canadians. In fact, it was a Japanese American congressman who led the call for Japan to recognize and compensate the former comfort women, and led the movement that resulted in the US Congress passing a resolution to that effect in 2007. So that's a Japanese American congressman making common cause with the Chinese Americans, the Korean Americans. And in Southern California, the redress movement was joined by the Armenian Americans, who regarded it as a cause of another example of ethnic brutality in the past. So it was part of the assertion of ethnic memory in the American social political scene. And the place or space for it was primarily local and national. Local in places like New Jersey or Glendale, California for the statues. National in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. The surviving comfort women were central here. Asia was important, but secondary to the assertion of the injustice perpetrated in ethnic discrimination in the past. So that's another circle, if you like. The fourth circle, I call it memory politics. And here the agents of memory were governments, leaders, civil society, both advocates for comfort women's redress and denialists of comfort women. Because when it comes to public memory, people who deny the Holocaust or the comfort women actually contribute to public presence. And it's in combating their denials that the comfort women become even better known. So these are leaders in government and civil society who were evoking memory for domestic political purposes, usually in support of a regime or party in power. And they also wielded history as a weapon in foreign relations, international relations. So this includes Japanese, South Korean, Chinese political leaders, of course, but also in the West, the United States, Germany, and others who in 2014-15 pressed Japan and South Korea very hard to solve what had become known in East Asia as Japan's history problem. And they wanted them to do that because of their interest in Northeast Asian security. So the Western nations had their own separate interests in the politics of the memory of the comfort women. The context, the time, was the growing importance of the politics of memory around the world in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, but particularly after the end of the Cold War in 1989-91. And this was followed by the increasingly instrumental use, or weaponizing, if you want, of the past for national, patriotic, and populist purposes. Now, this is a nationalistic phenomenon seen around the globe today. Russia, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, China, India, the US, Argentina, Brazil. I mean, the list goes on. And so there's a larger political trend here that has made memory a political issue. And this is the fourth circle. The place was obviously national in the first instance, and international in political use. But in fact, as I just said, it was everywhere grounded in national self-interest or political self-interest within the nation. So this is a circle of memory politics that is bounded by the nation, not by the rights of women, or even by the suffering of the former comfort women themselves. And the fifth circle, the final one for me today, is the comfort women as traveling memory, or what I call a traveling trope, like the Holocaust, moved around the world, invoked in different places, with some of the same meanings and some different meanings. And the agents of memory in global terms were very diverse and diffuse. There are people who mention the comfort women in many different forms, media, and sectors, often with very little historical context, often very little reference to Asia, primarily as an instance of the violation of the rights of women, of sexual violence, of wartime rape, and present-day trafficking. And the time, or the context, is our time. It's now. And like slavery itself, what some may once have thought acceptable is now deemed immoral, illegal, and criminal in the context of contemporary views of human rights and international law. This is the main traveling definition of the comfort women. The refusal of the Japanese government to officially admit coercion and wrongdoing is secondary here, and the colonial context, which is so important in the discussions and advocacy of justice for the comfort women in South Korea, is often remote, unmentioned, and in many cases unknown. So the traveling trope travels often without, if you like, historical context or grounded local pasts. The place is obviously no single place. The space is global. It's a global memory culture. It's a shared inventory of dark or traumatic, often 20th century pasts, which have the objective of altering or preventing similar abuses in the present. Now, these 5 circles, can you put my circles up, please, Andrew? Thank you. So there are the 5 circles. And these 5 circles are, first of all, there are connections. They're connected by common themes that cross the line separating the different agents of memory, contexts, and places. For example, calls for recognition and redress, calls for compensation and apology for the victims, efforts to prevent sexual violence against women in the past and future. These cross the lines. These connections include transnational action, in which activists and victims from different places and perspectives join together in solidarity, as they did in the People's Tribunal held in Tokyo in 2000, and as they did in Seoul this past August in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of Kim Hak-sun's 1991 public testimony of her own experience. Now, the connections and collaborations run from the surviving comfort women and their advocates across the circles to the widest global circulation of the memory of the comfort women. But if there are connections, there are also separations. The activism often remains, to my mind, regrettably separate. Of course, there often is as much disagreement within a circle as between one and another. And yet I'm arguing that I think the circles matter. Each group or set of groups is anchored in its own time and space, its own present, past, principles, and prejudices, often focused on its own position. sometimes to the neglect of the surviving comfort women themselves. They become spokesmen for the comfort women, who become what one person has called global victims. They are moral witnesses, but they are separated in their place of witnessing. They sometimes will distort historical facts or ignore them. In short, the different agents of memories are often bounded by their circles, and so too are their perspectives on the comfort women. And one prime example at the present time is the nationalisms that permeate the recent positions of both South Korean and Japanese governments, and to some extent of the people. It seems that many Koreans prefer to insist that all comfort women were coerced, while Japanese officials want to insist that all comfort women were either prostitutes or volunteers. Now, neither of these is true. Some women were coerced, some were not. Some were recruited by Japanese and some by Korean middlemen. And of course, not all comfort women were Korean either. They come from 9 countries across Asia. And they included some Dutch comfort women in Indonesia. So there are nationalistic blinders on both the Korean and Japanese sides that are violating past facts and creating and fomenting present hostilities. And this does bother me. It does bother me that the comfort women become used for national or restricted purposes, sometimes to the exclusion of the larger issues, but more important, to the creation of these very vexed relations between those 2 countries. And there are lots of other examples. Other circles have their blinders too. But with the consequence that the transnational activism and the agents of memory often lack either the knowledge or the sympathetic imagination necessary to cross the lines and make truly common cause with those in the other circles. Thanks, Andrew. That's enough of that, I think. Just in conclusion, I just like to mention the largest circle, which it's even bigger than the global circle if you want. It's the fact that even as the agents of memory remain nationally, politically, or ideologically situated and separated, this is not the case of the understanding of the comfort women, in quotes, and their brutal experience. Like Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and Stalingrad, the comfort women no longer belong only to the victims who suffered or to the perpetrators of their suffering. They are now part of the global memory of 20th century war and violence, and they are part of the 21st century campaigns for gender equity and human rights. So the comfort women now belong to the largest circle. They belong to the world. And I think this is a truly phenomenal story, as I said. And I also think that their memory in this largest circle is a challenge, not to any single particular past alone, not to yours or mine or any others, but to our inextricably interconnected collective futures. And that, I think and hope, is the future of the memory of the comfort women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Gluck, for that introduction. We'll now turn to the question and answer section of the panel. And I guess I'll open up really quickly with my own question, but as we work to organize the questions in the chat box, but if anyone has any questions, please, again, type them in the chat box and we'll make sure that they're read aloud. So Professor Gluck, you spoke about these different circles of activists involved in championing the comfort women issue, and one of these groups being focused on mobilizing the case of the comfort women to draw attention to the broader issue of sexual enslavement. What effects does linking the experience of the comfort women in World War II to other instances of sexual violence during wartime in the 20th century have on the redress movement? Is linking the memory of these different instances of sexual violence something that supports or undermines the movement of redress specifically for the comfort women?
Do you want my opinion or the opinion of activists? I mean, my opinion is that as I've tried to say, these circles overlap and interact in it, and there are synergies among them. And it was very important, both in terms of the emergence of the comfort women into international space that there were commonalities between what had happened to the women in Asia with what had happened to the women, not only in Bosnia, but what had happened to the women in Berlin and the women in Manchuria and the women in southern Italy. And remember that these are stories that people kept to themselves for a long time. There were rapes throughout the world, rapes of civilians I'm talking about now, and very often by military. And they were not necessarily military brothel systems, although the other militaries did have military brothel systems. So I do think that bringing the whole question of this practically endemic and systemic, if you like, sexual violence against women during war. I mean, let's just keep it to war for the time being. It actually helps the cause of preventing all the future victims, and also of recognizing the experiences of all the past victims, none of whom were recognized. I mean, the women raped by Allied soldiers in southern Italy were never recognized either. They've remained family stories. So I think the synergies are really important. That's what I mean about crossing the lines among the circles, that was really important. And that's what I mean about the largest circle, the world, the global circle.
Yeah, that's actually a great connection into the next question from one of our audience members, Stephanie Lee, who was wondering if you could speak more on these synergies between these different groups of activists. And specifically, she was wondering where the Women's Tribunal would fall within these circles.
Actually, Stephanie says that she doesn't like my circles at all, that they're artificial and essentializing, and I couldn't agree more. I did it because I wanted to situate. I wanted to show you where the problems were coming from. It was in the situatedness. Of course, they're artificial and essentializing. The Women's Tribunal fall in the solidarity question, as I mentioned them. They are the border crossing. There's been solidarity from the beginning. There have been solidarity conferences, Asian solidarity conferences on the comfort women, where South Koreans and Japanese were the most prominent, but they were not the only members. The Women's Tribunal is one of the high points of the solidarity, the mock tribunal held in 2000. And as I said, they continue, victims and advocates continue to work across the borders. And those are the links. Those are the line crossing solidarities that I mentioned. They are critically important because they are the effective transnational activism that we can both understand and celebrate. But there are other sectors that don't join in that solidarity, and and who say, look, this is a post-colonial issue in South Korea. It shouldn't be hijacked by by universal ideas of justice. So you see that some people don't cross that line. So the solidarities are terribly important. Now, Stephanie has another question. Shall I just go on with it? Rape was illegal and a war crime even at the time of the comfort women system. Yes, it was illegal in military terms. It was not what happened in 1998, what happened actually in Rwanda and the Yugoslav trials, is that rape became a crime against humanity that was not a matter of military law. That had never happened before. And when you mentioned the Dutch women, there were war crimes tribunals all over Asia, not just the Tokyo trial, which was the counterpart of the Nuremberg trial. Those were the major leaders, but there were so-called BC war crimes trials for conventional war crimes. This is what rape was. Conventional war crimes held all over Asia. And in these conventional war crimes tribunals held in Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, after the war, the Japanese were tried for the comfort women system on behalf of Dutch women who had been recruited involuntarily into the comfort women system in Indonesia. That is the only example of a tribunal after the war doing it. And as everybody has commented, including the surviving, now deceased Dutch comfort women herself, that was primarily a indictment impelled by race rather than, I'm sorry, by race rather than by gender. It was the race of the women, in other words, not the Indonesian comfort women, but the Dutch comfort women who were the issue there. In the Tokyo trial, the Americans who investigated the comfort women, they called them comfort girls in the documents. They knew about them. They investigated them. They didn't think of prosecuting them. And my explanation for that is what I call context blind, familiarity blindness. I mean, they just assumed that those things went on, and they had plenty of documentation. They didn't regard it as a war crime. So that's the difference. But rape as a crime against humanity is the 1990s, and it was a signal advance, and the comfort women, as I said, were mentioned in all the arguments for that particular new kind of international law.
Thank you, Professor Clark. Malaika Robinson is asking, who deems activists, scholars, or politicians agents of memory, and what makes a contemporary agent of memory?
Well, hi, Malaika. Thanks for coming. At this point, memory activists have become a big category. It's relatively recent. I used the term already in 1998, but I didn't think of it as a essentializing or reifying, term. But there's a handbook coming out, the whole handbook of memory activism being published next year by Routledge. So now what's happened, and I don't want to define it for you, it's differently defined. A large number of people who study this think memory activists are only those who are active in the political sphere. Okay, people who are engaged in trying to change the politics of memory. There are others, and I count myself that, anybody who tries to intervene in the public memory of a particular issue, which means I am a memory activist in Japan. I'm not trying to change American ideas about public memory of the war. I am trying to intervene in Japanese ideas. I'm a memory activist. Why? Because that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do it on behalf of history. I worry when the facts are distorted and when selective and all the rest of it. So the point is that some memory activists call themselves that. Increasingly, they call themselves that. Sometimes scholars call them, and you can look at the Handbook of Memory Activism when it comes out. You'll see that the range is very wide. But I would stick by I think the widest definition is of those who try to intervene in public memory, not just study it for the sake of intervening. So that's it. And contemporary agents, what do you mean by that, Malaika? Contemporary agents? I don't know what you mean by that. Did I say something I didn't mean to say? People who are agents of memory today? I don't know what you mean. Well, let's go on, and I can come back to that.
Yeah, I can ask the next question, and if Malaika answers, I'll read it out loud in the next question. So Dongjae Min has a question on politics of memory versus reparations. So are ongoing diplomatic conflicts over reparations between South Korea and Japan another example of the weaponization of memory? And in a larger sense, are reparations a feasible remedy for traveling memories?
It's a great question. These are all good questions. They're not so easy. Well, the word reparations doesn't come into play here. It's compensation, because reparations are state to state, and compensation for the former victims or their families, depending on cases. That is the restitution, compensation. These are the words because people are trying to avoid the word reparations because there have been treaties signed that settle the reparations issue. So let me just change the language and say, what about compensation or restitution? Yes, this is absolutely an example of the weaponization of memory. What's going on between South Korea and Japan right now over the forced labor suits and the comfort women, first comfort women, now forced labor suits, is the weaponization of war memory. And the two governments are both behaving badly, as far as I'm concerned, in weaponizing this, because their main goal is not the compensation and restitution to the victims or their families. It's Japan bashing or South Korea bashing. Now, are reparations a feasible memory for compensation, restitution are one demand that almost every movement around the world, whether it's for forced laborers, for survivors of Holocaust, families of Holocaust survivors, whether it's the stolen children in Australia, or the Canadian First Peoples, or slavery in the United States, where we do use the word reparations because it's within the country. In the other countries, it's this business of restitution, compensation, apology. Every movement and every set of victims want several things. They all want the same several things. They want acknowledgement of the facts that this grievance took place, recognition. They want compensation, and they know that monetary compensation will never be enough, but they want compensation. They want knowledge transmission. They want their stories to be passed on in the education system and museums and things of that sort. They want apology, and they want apology from they want official apology. They want apology from the governments. And this is a kind of set. And so the answer is, one thing alone doesn't do it. For example, for compensation alone is not enough for the comfort women. They want an apology, right? And yes, it does help. It doesn't fix everything. But the reparations movement in the United States, which has a different complexity, but not completely dissimilar, is an important question of what do you do to compensate for or repair this kind of past injustice. Often, it's important to say, past injustices that continue in the present. They're not over, the repercussions of these past injustices, right? So the answer is, it's one of the remedies.
Thank you, Professor Gluck. June Kim has a question about the colonial construction of this racial hierarchy and its effects on the memory of comfort women. So how does the notion of race constructed during the colonial period of Japanese imperialism contribute to our current discourses of the comfort women system as sexual slavery?
That's an interesting question. You know, I can't answer it. I don't think I can answer it. I can say something that might pertain to an answer, which is that the comfort women issue between Japan and Korea, South Korea, has heated up in the last 11 years, all right? If you look at South Korea and Japan in the late 90s and in the early 2000s, this was not a heated issue. It was not. And I don't want to go into all the details, but you can go to Kim Do-jo. I mean, there's lots of examples. So you have to ask yourself, I asked myself, what made something that was not a heated issue a heated issue? And my answer is politics in both countries domestically. It started with the 2011 Constitutional Court ruling in South Korea. And so if race is an issue, it's not a fundamental issue. It may be, if it's invoked, it doesn't go back to the colonial period, because somehow they forgot about it for a long time. And also, I want to say something else. Japanese polls show that young people, that the majority of all people in Japan think the comfort women system was wrong, think former comfort women should be compensated, think that people speak out, that the right-wing people in Japan who speak out defending the comfort women are out of order. And then in the younger demographics, I mean, so this is a government issue. Now, it doesn't mean it's not having impact on populations, because as the nationalism surges in both places, but I don't see it as a race issue. I see it as a political issue. But I don't know the answer, and I'm very happy to see the race issue pointed out to me. I mean, I haven't seen it, and I certainly don't understand. I don't see it as something that caused that change in the last 12 years.
Thank you, Professor Gluck. We have a question, an anonymous question in the chat box, and this person was just wondering if you could speak more on what you meant by hijack by universal ideas for justice, and just essentially what the problem with it is.
Okay, well, I don't see it as a hijacking, obviously. I see it in, as I said in the answer to the first question, as a good line crossing, that this actually helps women everywhere. I mean, women are the constant object of sexual violence. We know that in our own society, in peacetime as well as war. We know how hard it is to get any kind of justice, if you want, or any kind of grappling with the problem on behalf of past and future victims. So it doesn't bother me, but there have been some writers in South Korea who think that with quite good basis, that this was a colonial phenomenon. These women in South Korea were recruited under the colonial regime. They were involuntary, voluntary labor, right? And that the colonial issue, and they have a point. Why do they have a point apart from what I just said? They have a point because Japan has not, it's done, believe it or not, a better job of recognizing the comfort women society-wide than it has in recognizing the colonial past. The Japanese have not come to terms with their being post-imperial. Now it turns out that it's taken a very long time for Britain and the Netherlands and France and other countries to become Germany to deal with their colonial past. This is very difficult. France hasn't, I'm in Paris now. France is not a poster child for dealing with the colonial past. So another reason for insisting on the colonial past aspect is because Japan hasn't confronted that. And what they've said is that when you start talking about universal human rights and violation of the human rights of women, you lose the historical context. That's what they mean. I mean, it now becomes a universal moral injustice and a crime. And what about the whole colonial context that created, enabled, and fostered this? That's what they mean. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Gluck. Durga has a question on transformative constitutionalism and its effect on politics of memory. So did the changing notion of global transformative constitutionalism affect the politicization of the memory circles as we move from the 20th to 21st century?
To some extent, yes, particularly because a lot of the newer constitutions, and there are a lot of them, and they have had now for quite a while, not only 21st century, they have a gender. They have several, usually gender provisions. And so it does matter that things are built, it matters even more to some extent that things are built into domestic a law, not just into international law, which has limited purview, as you know. I think global transformative constitutionalism, which people talk about a lot, is a really good thing. It's still very aspirational in terms of global and transformative. But these things happen slowly and you never know. It's definitely a move in the right direction, but constitutions are paper things and they have to be implemented and enacted in real life. I do think that the gender provisions are definitely important, not only in constitutions, by the way, but in international organizations. I mean, in the UN, in lots of other ways. The UN is very active in this, and that does matter, and it's transformational. So yes, a good thing, and potentially over time, a very important thing.
Thank you, Professor Gluck. So we're going to answer our last question from the Q&A section, conscious of everyone's time, and then turn to my co-chair, Olivia, for the last question of the session. So Jay Lee has a question about education on this issue in the US. So there seems to be an insufficient amount of educational discourse and pedagogy of comfort women issues and awareness in the American educational system. Do you see an importance in education and exposure of these issues in younger American education? And if so, could you discuss the future of this education in relation to the circles of memory, especially in regards to the second, third generation redress movement in the US?
Well, this is that. Thank you for that question. This is in the realm of diasporic memory in the diaspora, because as you know, in education in the United States, it's all state by state, and even within states, it can be school board by school board. But for the time being, state by state, every battle has to be fought state by state. There's no national education ministry, and right now I'm happy for that. But anyway, so in California, where the Asian Americans have been so active for so long, it is in the textbooks. It is in the curriculum. It's in the state curriculum, the comfort women, and other things. So California, the activists have been successful, and that partly because they've been so active, and partly because they are important in the state. So that's a standout example. In other states, there have been some examples, but less so. There are instances of small intrusions. You have to start by changing the curriculum before you can get the textbook the way that it works. You can't have it in the textbook without it in the curriculum, and well, it's complicated. But the answer is that they have begun. And I can't give you chapter and verse on it, but several states have begun to put not just the comfort women fits in different places in some of the curricula. And it's beginning to migrate a bit. I don't know, from the wartime question to the gender question, to the and that's primarily in high schools, not in the middle school business. So I think the future, Jay, the future of the circles, future of education, I have the utmost respect for the dynamism and energies of the Asian Americans in the redress movement here. It's not only Asian Americans, obviously, but they have really driven it in many of these states. And my guess is that over time they'll be in, I don't know in what form, because we've had a hard time getting much World War II memory into the curriculum. I mean, it's not just the comfort women who are missing. A lot is missing. So there's a bigger battle to be fought. But my guess is that with those energies, that you will see this continue. Now, remember, we have very few of the former comfort women left. In August in Seoul, there were only 14 South Korean comfort women left, and there were fewer now, actually. And so it doesn't mean that memory is going to die out, but it means it will change, and it will become, just as you know, we are still remembering the Civil War, and those people who have experienced it have been gone a long time. So it doesn't have to do with fading or memory. It has to do, I think, with the comfort women becoming what they already are, which is an example of an unacceptable violation of human rights, denigration of women, sexual violence, and whatever. And so in that way, I think they will be known, and their being known will be a help in this whole larger redress movement, if you like, or larger prevention movement, which goes way beyond World War II.
Thank you, Professor Gluck. So for the final question, I'll turn to my co-chair, Olivia, to ask our closing question.
Hello, Olivia.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here today. I've learned so much. I was wondering, how did the genders of the victims and the victimizers shape the narratives of these events, and then their place in public memory?
How does the gender affect?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question, because there are. I do want to. You have to give a shout out to the men, because there were an awful lot of male activists on behalf of the comfort women. Most of the Japanese lawyers who were so active, not only in the comfort women court cases, but in the UN, and the scholars were men, are men. So there have been men involved in the comfort women from the beginning, and the journalists were most often men, actually. So there's a solidarity, there's a solidarity across the genders in terms of the movement. But the deeper question is the fact that they were women. How did that, and the fact that they were elderly women, they're an amazing story. I mean, let me just run back and say, when I said it's an unusual story, think about it for a minute. These women who were already very elderly in 91, more elderly in 2000 at the time of the mock tribunal, and one of them still going strong, and now wants to take the redress to the court in The Hague, not the ICC, but the court in The Hague. Those women were scattered across Asia. Yes, there were more in South Korea, but they were scattered across Asia. They were very elderly. Most of them had never spoken out about what they'd done, even in their families, even to their husbands if they had them. Some of them were illiterate. They didn't know one another. The women from East Timor didn't know the women. I mean, just think about this. This is a group of older women without a movement, without an organization, who didn't know one another, were not empowered. But by telling their stories, and by being willing to tell their stories, and being willing to keep on fighting, like Lee is today, they made something happen in international law, in public memory. It's an incredible story. So their gender, in some ways, their gender didn't seem to diminish their impact. Now, there were people, and there's certainly been not denialists in Japan and elsewhere, who say things like, military brothels are important because during wartime, men, et cetera, and so forth, and and they take the same patriarchal view. But the impact of the comfort women was interesting. They could have been disregarded. They had no power. They had no organization. They still don't in that way. So in a way, I actually think that their testimony and their presence trumped in a way the kind of natural discrimination against their gender. Now, that doesn't mean that the issue, I think the other thing that really helped is the United Nations, because the United Nations on the Council on Human Rights has been on the discrimination against women, CEDAW, has been working on this for decades now. And comfort women are very important in that story. And so I think that the other reason that the gender hasn't disadvantaged them so much is because gender, at least in some circles, and there are some very important circles, is seen as such an important issue. And if you look at the UN SDGs, the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see gender several times, and you'll see it in conjunction with sexual violence, and you'll see it. So at least this is now something that is in the discourse, which, it wasn't that many decades ago that it wasn't. I take you back to even the International Declaration of Human Rights. It's there, but it's not there in this way. And that's 1948. So gender matters in a funny way. It's almost I would like to say a positive way it matters. Writ large, in general. But there's also ways in which the traditional views counter this view, particularly in certain circles. Certainly Japanese conservative government and right-wing circles are not enlightened on the place of women, right? We know that. But they are older, and they're getting even older, which turns out to be, in their case, good for us. So the younger people don't feel the same way. The intellectual formation, even their social political formation is different. Even in Japan, where you think that they're different. So we're in a long transition period, I think, on the questions of gender discrimination. We have a lot of work to do on gender equity. That's the biggest issue. If you want to put it in contemporary policy terms, it's gender equity, which is the result of gender discrimination, that is really the issue around the world, I think. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Professor Gluck. And that was our last question for our panel. I think we're running up on time, but again, thank you for running this session. It's so important to not only be able to understand what factors are shaping public memory, but then also being able to study specific context and understand how we apply our understanding of these factors to effectively advocate for redress for victims of mass violence. So thank you so much, Professor Gluck. And thank you so much to our audience members for participating. If you're interested, I know it's a Friday, so thank you for taking the time out of your day. But if you're interested in being notified for our future events, please follow the UCGT on social media. We're on Instagram and Facebook. And also on November 4th, we're having an event on the psychological effects of the US pullout from Afghanistan and the war on terror. So if you're interested, please sign up for that event as well. But anyway, as always, thank you again for joining our conversation, and we look forward to seeing you all at future events.
And thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your terrific questions. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I couldn't answer them all as well as I would have liked, but thanks so much. And thanks to the UCGT. Go, UCGT.